DoDonPachi, Dai-Ou-Jou, to die a blissful death. A bullet-ridden aircraft, blood leaking from the cockpit, a mourning replicant figure caressing the vehicle, its wires linked, suggesting a connection with the pilot. It's amazing how thematically relevant this promotional poster alone conveys the game's overall brutal experience. You, the player, are the pilot, and you will die. Blissfully? That's debatable. I'm not going to lie to you guys. Covering Dai-Ou-Jou, or DOJ, as an arcade admirer, not a savant, is pretty intimidating, mainly due to the monumental impact this game has struck the genre. If you were to ask any shoot-'em-up fan what their favorite shmups were, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone else that doesn't place DOJ at least in their top 5, let alone their favorite period. And yet, despite this legacy, owning this title, at least in its most complete state, hasn't been easy for fans, but that will soon change in the next few months. Regardless, I'm going to tackle this giant to the best of my ability. I'm sure the diehards will fill in the gaps or correct me in the comment section. As always, I welcome that completely. Without any more delay, let's jump in. Despite Cave's fear of Pro Gear being their last title, it seems like fate had a different hand to play out for these developers. First impressions of the attract mode clearly shows us this is indeed a sequel to DoDonPachi. The tried and true ship mechanics seem to be intact, large and rapid bursts of bullets, the focused yet powerful lasers, and the enemy clearing bombs to give yourself a breather from enemy fire. Although familiar, it's everything else that's built upon this structure that gives DOJ its identity. Visually, the environments seem more interactive and even lived in compared to the first game. In DoDonPachi, the battles seem to take place in, well, battlefields. However, the first stage in DOJ directly takes place in a populated, futuristic setting. We've seen this in S-Braid as well. Japan really likes to play out the Blade Runner environments, but I enjoy that kind of thing, so I'm not complaining. That leads us to our next question. Why is this populated city under attack? As a quick recap, pilots, the player, part of the DonPachi squadron were misled by Colonel Schwarlitz into wiping out their fellow comrades, disguised as enemies, to simultaneously reduce the world's population and to push these pilots into becoming elite super soldiers. Although Schwarlitz was defeated, millions died in this process. Weapons from the aftermath were transported and sealed internally on the moon. That brings us to our current day setting 1,000 years later. The world is now repopulated and the moon was colonized, aptly named Lunopolis, a futuristic city where humans and androids coexist, but not equally. Despite the destructive history, realities of the past are morphed into modern myths. Unfortunately for the citizens of Lunopolis, this sealed and forgotten weaponry was autonomous, slowly rebuilding their destructive forces. Eventually, the machines severed the seal and Lunopolis was completely vulnerable to its invasion, leaving little time to revitalize the DonPachi squadron. 2 ships were developed and elemental dolls were to accompany these pilots. These dolls enhance the airship's capabilities and aid the pilot with tactical foresight. It's now up to them to stop this onslaught and to destroy the revitalized Hibachi. Now, as we come to expect, each ship and elemental doll has their unique properties. Ship A uses a focus-driven shot, while Ship B's specialty is a spread shot. Now, when it comes to the replicants, and forgive me if I butcher these names, Shodia's normal shot is her strongest trait and can hold up to 6 bombs. Lan Yan's strongest suit is her powerful laser, but she can only hold 4 bombs. Xe is skilled with both shot types, but the trade-off is only being able to hold 2 bombs. The chaining mechanic was also carried over from DoDonPachi. When enemies are destroyed, your chain meter increases. Keeping this chain up requires constant interaction. However, your meter will quickly drop, even with the shortest amount of inactivity. The trick is to use your laser, preferably on bigger enemies, to keep the meter steady. This means it's technically possible to keep a single chain going throughout all 5 stages. Neat! You won't be witnessing this from me. This emphasis on chaining goes hand in hand with the new mechanic called the Hyper System. Keeping your chain going while collecting B-metals and attacking enemies within a short proximity builds your hyper meter. When it's filled, a hyper drop appears. When activated, your damage input increases and cancels all bullets on screen. On top of that, the rate at which your chain meter builds increases significantly, especially when attacking larger enemies and bosses. Again, neat! But as this was my first time playing DOJ, I had trouble keeping this in mind while I was constantly surrounded by bullets. For my first run, I selected Ship A with Xe. Why Xe? Because I'm not a lolly D-gen. As your ship descends into battle, you're serenaded with one of the most iconic arcade OSTs to exist on God's green earth. Just listen. Man, with music like that, it almost makes you forget how sadistic the difficulty is. The first stage definitely requires more out of you than most shmups. In fact, the stage boss Suzaku doesn't let up either. Fun fact, Suzaku is one of the many reoccurring stage bosses in the DoDonPachi series. Its name translates to Vermilion Bird, which is one of the 4 Chinese constellations. We can expect to see more constellation bosses continuing on. On the second stage, it occurred to me that you guys would think that after all these shmups I've been covering for the series, I would keep my hitbox in mind. I think my problem is I'm more focused on destroying the enemy than looking at my ship's placement. Besides that tangent, the music on this stage is more subtle than the first stage, but it fits. Byakko, the White Tiger, is the second stage boss, and I really like its design. He's just a chunker. It's here when I realized that other than the swarming bullets, what makes DOJ so difficult is how fast the enemy fire rate is. But despite his patterns being more brutal than Suzaku, he drops pretty quickly. Stage 3 is definitely where Cave mugged its arcade players. There's a gaping difficulty discrepancy between stages 2 and 3. This is actually a good segue to bring up that loops were brought back from DoDonPachi. If you recall in the second chapter of this Cave retrospective, when you meet specific requirements, such as not losing more than 2 lives and reaching a chain combo above 270 or 300, depending what ship you use, you'll loop into a second run, this time with the difficulty cranked up and being able to face the true end boss. The same applies here, just with different requirements to reach. So when DOJ was ported to the PlayStation 2, there was a mode called Death Label. It's just DOJ, but with one crucial trade-off. Unlimited credits are disabled. You have exactly 1 credit to complete this harsh game. It wasn't until 7 years after the release of this port that a player called Mon cleared both loops in DOJ. Now, the reason I'm even bringing this up is that it's specifically Stage 3 on the second loop where aspiring DOJ professionals retire. So as an amateur myself, complaining about the difficulty spike on this stage, on the first loop alone should affirm that it's not just me when I say that this level slams the gas in difficulty. But to get back on track, eventually I reached the stage boss Genbu, the Black Tortoise. He sprays bullets in all sorts of directions, and yep, he's pretty tough. In Stage 4, the BGM really fits the environment. Honestly, all of the tracks fit DOJ's set pieces, but this one specifically sounds extremely fitting. I've come to realize a good soundtrack has the power to place you in an environment with the music alone. I've tested this point to a few of my friends. I usually play this song from the Chrono Cross OST and ask them what kind of environment they envision when hearing this. Feel free to tag along here. Now, after I play a segment, a good portion of them say something like forest, woods, or mystical, and they're correct. And I believe DOJ shares the same sentiment when it comes to this stage music. Aside from that, it was this stage that made me second guess choosing Xe. Having 2 bombs is not enough for beginners like me. But oddly enough, while I was fighting the stage boss Seiryu, the Azure Dragon, I felt like I was recognizing and dodging its bullet patterns more efficiently than Genbu's. The final stage is just a commemoration of everything and all things DoDonPachi. The hive-like setting, the mid-bosses being callbacks to DDP stage bosses, the soundtrack itself is a callback to the first stage. This all interconnects thematically and completely fits the stage's BGM, aptly titled Grieving Womb. The song builds up as you descend and confront the chaos within. Any subtle movement in the wrong direction will be met with certain death, and yet despite the crushing difficulty, the music compels you to push on. It's as if the music was communicating to the player, look how far you've come. I didn't care how often I was dying at this point. This stage was the bow tie that sealed my understanding of why bullet hell fans love Dai-Ou-Jou. I was experiencing bliss, even in death. Then I faced Koryu and the painfully mediocre boss kicked in, killing my runner's high. That's actually the nitpick I have, and this doesn't just apply to Dai-Ou-Jou, but most cave titles. The boss music is usually mid at best, and I really wish all the bosses had different themes. Anyway, Koryu, the yellow dragon, is the quote, final boss, and ties together the previous 4 Chinese constellation themed bosses. After defeating him, the character-specific cutscene kicks in. I'm sure something is going on here, but unfortunately there's a little bit of a language barrier. And that's it. The end. Oh yeah, Black Label. 6 months after the release of Dai-Ou-Jou, Cave released another version in limited quantity known as DoDonPachi Dai-Ou-Jou Black Label. This revision gave Dai-Ou-Jou quality of life improvements. Just to name a few, the bullet fire rate is slower, the hypermeter feels faster, the player can continue if they lose all their lives in the second loop by inserting more credits, and overall, the game is easier. Although, not by much. What's also cool about the Black Label PCB is that now you have your choice between playing Black or White Label. But one option I really respect is after selecting your loadout, you have your choice between a single run or a second loop run. Guys, I love this edition. I've stated this before, but I believe second loops are overkill just to experience the true boss. And before the get good alpha chads crucify me, my criticism with this has more to do with pacing than it does difficulty. I do believe in earning an experience, but just repeating content and increasing the difficulty knob just seems tacked on. I think Mushihime-sama Futari, say that 5 times, did this right by letting the player choose their difficulty. If you pick the easiest one, too bad, I guess you're not facing the true final boss. Regardless, in Dai-Ou-Jou Black Label, you can experience the true final boss with either option. Look at that. You get to have your cake and eat it too. Stage 3 still has a large difficulty spike though. I tried to optimize a better loadout than my White Label run, but it turns out it doesn't matter who you play as if you suck ball. On the final stage, I was pretty proud of how long I lasted in this segment. Not a big deal to some veterans out there, but hey, I'll give myself a pat on the back. So if you guys couldn't tell based on my first run through White Label, I didn't meet the requirements to face the true boss through the second loop. Surprising, I know. But since I chose the single round option, I actually get to experience the true final boss. Koryu is technically just the containment shell for the returning antagonist Hibachi. And I gotta tell you, I was just laughing at how unrelenting this battle was. I know anger is usually associated with higher difficulties, but sometimes difficulty is so over the top that it's just funny more than frustrating. It's like, what the fuck am I supposed to do here? Again, I know if I practice I can get through it, but as I currently stand, holy shit. But wait a minute, how are we even able to experience this game? As I stated in the last chapter covering Pro Gear, wasn't Cave sales dwindling? Wasn't public interest in shmups overall declining? Well, yes actually, but it turns out when you leave a legacy like Cave did, a small resurgence is possible. In May of 2001, DoDonPachi 2 B-Storm hit the streets of Japanese arcades. Except this game wasn't created by Cave. It was developed by a Taiwanese company known as International Game System, IGS, on their Polygame Master PGM board. Tsuneki Ikeda elaborates in a 2010 IG magazine interview. They had acquired the license from us to make a new DoDonPachi game for their hardware. They wanted to import S-Braid, but that was a completely different sort of PCB. So they just got the license and made their own game, DoDonPachi 2. The interviewer intervenes and states, a lot of Cave fans don't seem to care for DoDonPachi 2. Ikeda retorts, as it turned out, DoDonPachi 2 performed extremely well. IGS sold it in Asia and then brought it to the Japanese market a few years later, where we first saw it. That was what convinced us to re-enter the arcade market. So it turns out, Cave may have actually cashed in their chips a little too soon when they sold the DonPachi license to IGS. Because despite DoDonPachi 2 being painfully mediocre in its execution, it absolutely crushed the arcades. These results spelled out that the DoDonPachi brand had more weight than Cave initially thought. However, when Cave was considering leaving the arcade market, it wasn't just due to popularity trends, but also the fact that publishers didn't want to collaborate, and publishing themselves was too much of a financial risk. So logically, after the success with IGS's iteration of DoDonPachi, why not develop games for IGS? This is what ultimately led to the creation of DoDonPachi's true sequel, Dai-Ou-Jou. So great! Cave had all their ducks in a row. The market proved that there was still interest in shmups, and they could continue developing games. Smooth sailing from there, right? Well guys, I have to admit something to you. In the last chapter of this retrospective, I shared this quote by Ikeda about their struggles developing Pro Gear on the PS2 hardware. Oh yes, it was really hard. We were all pretty distraught with it. Well, that wasn't the full quote. This is the full quote. Oh yes, it was really hard. We were all pretty distraught with it. But, as bad as the CPS2 was, the hardware for DoDonPachi was even worse. A real nightmare. Ikeda follows this up again in the March 2010 issue of Arcadia magazine. It caused us to reevaluate the way we had been doing things, because that was no longer going to work with this hardware. The programming know-how we acquired then is still paying dividends today. If you want to get your skills up, there's no better way than working with inferior hardware. To step back for just a second, many shmup players consider Dai-Ou-Jou to be Cave's magnum opus. I mean, this game is set on the holiest of all holy pillars, and the hilarious irony is that this game was developed on weak, convoluted, shit hardware. That is absolutely amazing. This just gives me ammo to my pre-existing stance that limitations pushes out creativity. But despite this, short development deadlines can still constrict a certain level of polish. This is why Black Label exists. Ikeda explains in the previous interview, the deadlines were so strict on that game. We pleaded for just one more week, and they gave us 3 days. When we came back to it after taking a break for a few days and playing it again, I realized, the balance is a little too harsh. After reflecting on what balance we were originally aiming with DoDonPachi, we thought about what adjustments and corrections we could make. At the same time, the topic of an overseas release for DOJ came up, and we resolved to release an overseas version with a better balance. So it was a long and winding road, but that's how Black Label came out for DOJ. I've been referring to Ikeda about DOJ's development so far, but if you guys have been watching this retrospective, you can probably piece together that the promotional poster and the art design was once again led by Junya Inoue. I've said before that Inoue's strong art design is what helped give Cave a sense of identity. However, that's further assisted by Manabu Namiki's composition. I truly believe a good soundtrack is what makes an excellent game into a transcendent game. To me, Namiki accomplished this. Digging further into his background, he was also responsible for the music in Ketsui, Escaluda 2, and Mushihime Sama Futari. Those titles I referred to all vary in artistic atmosphere. Yet despite that, Namiki has the ability to create music that best suits those worlds. And you know the guy has class because all of the tracks are puns of other shoot-'em-up companies. Muke, NMK, Saikyo, Taito. This leads me to my overall thoughts of why I believe DOJ is loved by hardcore shmup fans. It was developed by a dream team. Ikeda's competence as a game design leader, Inoue's detailed and artistic worlds, and Namiki's ability to convey those worlds through relevant and thematic music. We have now trapped lightning in a bottle. I understand DoDonPachi is what put Cave on the map, and it's still an extremely competent game. But with these combined forces, at least in my estimation, is what gave DOJ a stronger identity. So DOJ's currently existing ports have an interesting background, to say the least. Some ups and some downs, if you will. Normally I just mention what consoles you can play this on at the end, but in this instance, an explanation is warranted. DOJ's first port was handled by Arika. This was a 2-disc set, one disc being the game, and the other disc being a bonus DVD of the best DOJ players at the time completing White Label. The game featured an arcade mode, a simulation training mode with replay capabilities, which was a first for the time, a no bullet mode, gallery, and as I previously mentioned, death label mode. No bullet mode is where all the enemies, you guessed it, don't shoot any bullets. But this feature wasn't added for you just to effortlessly plow through enemies, but to familiarize enemy placement for real runs. The port was revered for accuracy and thoughtful content, but there was one missing component. Black Label. Does this make the whole package pointless? Absolutely not. What you have here is an extremely faithful port of White Label, but knowing that this is missing such a well-balanced rendition of the game does mildly damper that package. That brings us to the 360 port of Dai-Ou-Jou, this time handled by 5PB. And by handled, I mean manhandled. This port was thrown together so haphazardly. It's like 5PB just took the PS2 port code and mangled it to work on the 360. Oh wait, that's exactly what happened. Imagine taking the engine of a Ford Mustang and putting it into a Chrysler PT Cruiser. Will it run? God, maybe with heavy modifications. But will it run well? I don't think so. How the story goes is that 5PB was taking a little bit too long developing this port. Out of desperation, someone was able to acquire Arika's PS2 port code without permission and implemented that on 360 hardware. What was the result? Bugs, graphical glitches, and long load times. I mean, extremely long load times. It takes a minute just to reach the main menu, but getting into actual gameplay roughly takes another minute. It damn near takes 2 minutes just to play the game. Comparing this to Arika's PS2 port, it takes 25 seconds just to get to the menu, and an additional 15 seconds to start playing. That's half the time of the 360 port. Even scrolling between pictures in the gallery takes too long. This port was handled so poorly that 5PB made a public apology and stopped production until these issues were resolved. Cave jumped back in to clean up the mess, but even they hit a wall, and Microsoft had to pitch in to finish up the patch. Finally, after a year, most of DOJ Black Label Extra's problems were resolved, and production continued. I can only imagine the frustration diehards must have felt upon its initial release. That being said, this was not my experience playing this port. I'm able to experience this game through my modded Xbox 360 with the patch applied. And honestly, it's okay. I used a wired arcade stick and a regular controller, and I really didn't experience notable latency. And yes, getting everything started took a while, but it didn't take as long as the day one release. On a positive note, I actually like this UI, and the background music is pretty good. In terms of features, this version does contain both white and black label. There's also an additional mode known as X mode. It's meant for beginners and throws in a new elemental doll called Piper. She can't use any bombs, but she's extremely powerful. There's also a new arranged soundtrack, but I don't like it. Thankfully, you can change it back to the original OST. Something else I noticed, I don't think there's an option to enable free play. I understand unlimited credits can ruin the tension if there isn't consequences for mistakes, but on the other hand, it can also help players get better as long as they're not mindlessly slogging through it. Overall, even with the inclusion of Black Label and the patch fix, in my opinion, the PS2 port still trumps the 360 port. Is the 360 port as bad as everyone says it is post-fix? No, but Arika's port is so thoughtful and content-rich that even if 5PB released their port as intended, I still believe it would have been a mediocre port. And really, compared to Arika, I don't think 5PB even had a chance to begin with, mainly because Arika is familiar with arcade hardware, because they have made arcade hardware. They're responsible for the Street Fighter EX series, which has also been ported by Arika themselves. So if you want to pick this up, I'd snag Arika's port. Just make sure you have a Japanese PlayStation 2, as this game is region locked. Is what I would have said because earlier this year, M2 Shot Triggers announced that they're bringing DOJ to the Switch and PlayStation 4. Features contain a detailed HUD to keep track of your progress, a super easy mode, an arcade rundown mode for players to practice difficult bullet patterns, and much more. Oh, and more importantly, white and black label are prominently included in this port. Based on a few of these features, it's clear that M2 is taking notes from Arika. M2 as a whole is notorious for damn near arcade-perfect ports with some useful modes sprinkled in. I can't stress how important that level of competency is appreciated. When arcade ports are handled haphazardly, you now have two different experiences with one game. That's not exactly a great thing. I'm not trying to come across as a purist. I personally can tolerate minor trade-offs, but if there's a possibility to squeeze as much accuracy as possible with these arcade ports, that is always going to be the desired outcome. Thankfully, M2 Shot Triggers holds that kind of reputation, and I am happy to see that DOJ is finally getting the treatment it definitely deserves. It's clear that DoDonPachi Dai-Ou-Jou has left a strong impact in the bullet hell genre. Its brutal difficulty, lush and detailed backdrops, and its immersive soundtrack has captivated arcade players that had the pleasure of experiencing it. After playing multiple iterations of DOJ, I completely understand why fans have placed this title on such a high pedestal. Is it my favorite Cave title? No, actually, but I'm a filthy shmup casual, so you can take my opinion with a grain of salt. But like most shoot-'em-up chads, I would put DOJ somewhere in my top 5. Again, it's pretty crazy to think Cave was considering tapping out of the arcade market, then seemingly busts out one of their best titles to date. Despite the rejections from publishers, despite developing on convoluted hardware, despite the negative market premonitions, their passion for developing games has superseded all of that. I guess the next question is, can they keep this up?